And then another young student who I'll be actually seeing on June 1st. I'll be meeting with him, Ilmars Rimšēvičs, the head of the central bank in Latvia. Of course, though, to call it a central bank is to flatter them, as they perform none of the functions of a central bank, but at the very best, function as a currency board. They have no autonomous monetary policy, which is a big deficit when one is trying to organize anything like a development plan. Now, so you have these three key figures. And what I'm trying to do here is to historicize a model for introducing neoliberalism into an economy, to show that it's not just a theory, but that we can actually discuss in detail, concretely, how this can and was done in the case of Latvia, and what its implications for policy would be today. Well, Viksnīņš got a hold of these guys, had them at Georgetown briefly in 1990 in Latvia, and he's kind of an inspiring figure. So he got these young gentlemen, Guadman is not so young, very excited about these ideas, which he was talking about. And he went on to create a group, a policy group, which, when Latvia became independent, would set the country's economic policy from the outset and from Guadmanis's hopes, hopefully in perpetuity. In fact, he said as much. He said we need to create a system in which the normal changing of governments cannot change. So he didn't want, this is very much in the federalist tradition, by the way, in the United States, but that's an even bigger digression, which I won't tax your indulgence and patience with. So Juris Viksnīņš formed something called the Georgetown Gang. This is not a pejorative term, which I or others who have been critical of what they have done have used. That's what they call themselves. We often get this with academics, and sometimes even especially with economists. They have their nice little tidy offices and nice middle class lives. They make reasonable low six-figure incomes, but they like to think of themselves as outlaws. And on weekends, maybe they'll get out of their Harley Davidson and put on some leather pants and pretend that they are rebels. Well, so Viksnīņš liked to see him and his group this way, and they formed a policy group in which they put together a series of 8 meetings and constructed a program called Latvia 2000. So what they wanted to see for Latvia by the year 2000. And essentially they put in place the model that we have seen since 1991. They would not have any industrial policy. Now, of course, we know much of Soviet industry was antiquated. It could not survive in a global market. But that's one thing. But what was not done, no attempt was made to catalog, to inventory what modern equipment existed in Latvia. And there was plenty that was quite new, plenty that actually came from West Europe. No attempt at actually inventorying what existed and what could be reorganized. And instead, they just let it all go. They let speculators grab whatever wasn't bolted down and what was bolted down and sell it off. Second, they decided to create a sound money. Well, it sounds reasonable. So they were going to have a strong currency. And they tied it, as you know, to 4 dominant currencies in the global system. And the working idea, both then and now, was that by having sound money, small budget deficits, you would attract foreign direct investment, and the economy would work out happily ever after. From then, everything would just take care of itself. Now, what happened, as we know, instead, was that Latvia did deindustrialize. The foreign direct investment did not materialize right away, so the 1990s proved to be quite tragic for Latvia. We saw significant out-migration. People more or less stopped having children. And we see some of the consequences of that today in terms of an entire generation that is kind of absent. People between about 20 and about 20 years out to 40 just are there in very, very small numbers. Now, this economy eventually did produce some foreign direct investment in the middle of the past decade, but it was not productive investment. At the time, people at both the Ministry of Finance and at the central bank were really besides themselves with pleasure when they finally saw that money began coming in. They really didn't reflect on what the money was doing. They were just happy that it was coming in. So what you began to see in 2004 was that a combination of three sources of capital created the famous real estate boom or bubble that we saw. One, as Latvia joined the European Union, structural funds began to come in. By 2004, the effects of the US adventure in Iraq began to play themselves out in terms of generating higher fuel prices. One of the things we don't often reflect on is that the US war in Iraq created a huge spike in the demand for oil, which helped to take oil prices up. That money then, of course, was laundered through Latvia, some of it, as it was being still exported out through no longer the pipeline, but at least by rail, and then to oil tankers. So a good bit of Russian money was sloshing around, looking to find safe investments. Real estate historically has been seen as safe. And then, of course, George Bush and his policy of keeping the United States going after the 2001 recession I guess this addressing the point that you referenced before and how the United States has dealt with its crisis, it started creating lots of money. So you had an increase in the global supply of capital, and that money was sloshing around the world system looking for investment opportunities. And of course, if you were in finance, you understood that there was a bargain. That bargain was buying dollars. You could get them for next to nothing and then invest them in other places where they would bring a return. So how did you do that? Well, typically you lent to those who were seeking to buy property. Well, we all know how that story ended. Not very well. I began issuing warnings about this as early as the fall of 2004, and Latvia met with two prime ministers, the Ministry of Finance and several others, but too many people were steeped in those property markets, and as a consequence, they had no interest in dealing with the real estate bubble, which had expanded to this dangerous size, and ultimately the whole thing blew up. And so now we're dealing with the consequence of that. So how did the Latvians deal with this crisis that erupted or blew up in 2008, in the fall of 2008? Well, they decided to more or less keep doing what they always did. Now, were they going to restrain spending? Sure, yes. But that gets back to their original guiding philosophy of restraining spending, something that they deviated somewhat from during the boom years. So they were going to do that. And then recognizing that they had really no monetary options, given the fact that they wanted to join the Eurozone, which kind of became a fetish for them rather than something to be looked at analytically and objectively. It became a matter of some psychological importance. They decided to pursue the now famous, infamous internal devaluation model. So they would attempt this grand experiment, which they played out on the stage of their country and its people. So we've had experience with this model now, and what have we seen? Well, we have seen that, of course, over the past 2 years, public sector salaries were driven down. Latvia still has somewhat of an inflation problem, but there's no question that wages have been driven down. We don't know how many people have left the country. We just know a lot. I mean, there's just not good data. Charles Wolfson, who's at Linköping University, is probably doing some of the best work on this topic, but even he will be the first one to tell you that there are no real numbers on this. What we do know anecdotally is that everyone you speak with in Latvia tells you of relatives who have just gotten out of the country. They've gone to the United Kingdom, they've gone to Ireland, they've left. And that one can find apartments in Riga to live in for next to nothing. You can just take over the communal fees that you owe the municipality or the state. People are just desperate to put anyone in these apartments that they own, as the owners have left the country. So that's where we find ourselves, in a situation in which the Latvians have pursued an internal devaluation model that's completely at odds with any historical experience in the West, where in the West, not that the West has the answers or solutions, but they have always pursued the opposite strategy of money creation during times of economic crisis. And so we'll yet to see the results of this model. At the very best, we will not see a return to 2007 and 2008 levels of per capita GDP until 2014, maybe later. So we have another lost 6 or 7 years. All things which the Latvians, I think, can ill afford. But right now we have Anders Åslund and Prime Minister Dombrovskis on a kind of international publicity tour where they are claiming that they now have the answer for how to deal with an economic crisis. Have an internal devaluation and have all of your young people leave the country. That is what is being promoted. So I'm looking forward to our engagement with each other in terms of questions and the presentation of my good colleague to the left and the questions that will ensue.
Thank you, Professor Sommers. Yeah, I'd like to leave the word to Professor Karsten Staehr because he's been very kind to be with us even if he's actually rather ill. So let you give a chance to make any comments you would like, perhaps on Estonia.
I will.
That's part of the global speed up. You're no longer allowed to be sick.
It's a consequence of globalization because I was in Bologna during the weekend and my stomach has got used to Kokopim and Karma, but the wonderful lunch yesterday was apparently a little bit too much. So if I suddenly run, it's maybe because of the opinions being expressed, but it can also be because of Bologna. I should say that I work in the Estonian Central Bank, but I'm not sort of an official representative. There are approximately 150 persons about me, so I'm sort of not really in the position to provide sort of official statement. I work in the research department, and our job is partly to question the sort of consensus in other departments of the central bank. So it's my own opinions, but let's see how it works out. Another good reason for not inviting a central banker for a discussion of fiscal policies, which fiscal austerity, is that you may be surprised to learn it, but actually central banks do not run fiscal policies. That is run by ministers of finance, who are headed by a finance minister who, in some countries, is democratically elected. So central banks do not run fiscal policies. The only sort of part Bank of Estonia takes, Eesti Pank. We have to say Eesti Pank now because we got into the Eurozone, and then we dropped Bank of Estonia, and we call ourselves Eesti Pank always. Okay.